Everyone, welcome. We are just in the process of joining attendees into our session. Hope everyone has had a great morning, are starting to have a great rest of their morning for people joining from other time zones, and a good afternoon for those in EST. We are here with the HBS Club of Toronto and Thorek Scott and Partners. I'm the president of the HBS Club of Toronto. I'm delighted to welcome you here with us for a session on returning to the office, managing the realities of hybrid work. We are going to have a very enlightening, insightful discussion right now with several panelists and led by Danielle Bouchen, who is our HBS Club of Toronto officer. And I wanted to share with you some quick logistics so that you're aware that as of this time forward, this session will be available in video. And as a result, if you raise your hand, if you ask a question, which we strongly encourage, then your question, if you don't go on video, your name, but if you do go on video, obviously your appearance will be recorded, will be part of our session. Please do keep your mics off otherwise during the discussion. And now I'm delighted to introduce Danielle Bouchen, who is an HBS Club of Toronto officer, and professionally Danielle leads HR data and analytics for the Royal Bank of Canada. She was previously a partner and a global portfolio leader at Mercer, focused on workforce metrics. Danielle holds a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations from the University of Toronto and a master's from the University of Waterloo, and is a graduate of the HBS GMP program. Welcome, Danielle.
Thank you, Boris. It's really great to be with you all today, and I'm excited to be bringing together this group of talented individuals who will share a little bit on their perspectives around what we're all experiencing right now. Many companies are starting to think about getting back into the office more fully than maybe we have been over the last 18 to 20 months. Some organizations are thinking about returning to the office in a very different way than they have in the past, where it might have been that FaceTime was really important at one point for many organizations and may not be now. Likewise, there may be organizations that are rethinking their real estate footprint entirely, and that changes the dynamics of the workplace. Those of you who are responsible for teams and health and safety in those organizations may be experiencing challenges with vaccination status, changes in the rules around vaccination status in the workplace, and even thinking through what does that mean for how we manage the employment experience and how we manage the employment contract itself. So it's going to be a wide-ranging discussion. There's a lot of moving parts here. There's change, there's culture, there's the practicalities of the labor conditions that we find ourselves in, and it's changing all the time. We see new variants emerging, we see changes in legislation, we see legislation that's being contested. For those of you who have staff in the US, you're probably well aware that the ETS that was issued by OSHA is being contested by the 5th District Court and has now been passed to the 6th District Court, and there's lots of discussion about what does that mean. So the group that I have here with me today is well versed in all of these issues, and let me start by sharing a little bit about each of them. Heather Stark, Heather wave so that everybody knows who you are. There you are. Heather had a recent hand injury and it's just getting better. Heather
is just a splint.
Yeah. On the mend. Executive coach and organizational development consultant. Heather has a strong focus on communication and culture, which I think is very important to the conversation we're having today. She has a master's in business administration from the Harvard Business School and is also a certified professional coach and a member of the International Coaches Federation. Henrik Newland, Henrik, wave for the crowd. Henrik is a partner at Shields, O'Donnell and McKillop. He is an employment and labor litigation specialist, and he holds a law degree from Queen's University. He has also clerked for the Judge of Ontario Divisional Court, and he's part of the Ontario community. He grew up around here. Katie Mundy. Katie, if you can wave for us. Katie is the future of work leader at Slalom Consulting. She specializes in organizational effectiveness. And as part of Future of Work has been really focusing on helping clients navigate the hybrid work model, in particular thinking through the working conditions, the culture and mindset that's required in that environment. Last but not least, Lauren Thorek. Lauren, hey. Lauren is a senior director at Thorek Scott and Partners, a recruiting firm here in the Toronto area. And she has a specialty in real estate investments and financial services industry, and can share some interesting perspectives on what she's been seeing in what is a pretty hot labor market right now, and what has changed in the nature of the conversation with potential candidates and their views on hybrid work. And I think that's a really good jumping off point for all of us today, is sort of thinking through the practicalities of the worker, the employee, whether they are a candidate for a role or in fact an existing employee in your organization. So much of this is about change management and the worker's impression. So maybe Katie, I'll start with you. And maybe you can share some perspectives on how do we keep the employee at the center of that conversation?
It's a great question, Danielle. And one that I hoped to hear over the last few months, that this was an obvious thing to do. And speaking to more and more clients, unfortunately, doesn't seem as obvious to some as I had hoped. At Slalom, we believe putting people at the center of everything we do is important. So our main objective with clients is to help them understand that no matter what you do, if you're moving into some sort of decision on return to work, you have to do a proper pulse check with your people. This is not a year ago we did something, we asked a few questions. This is a targeted, specific to hybrid working, understanding of how people are feeling and their sentiments. Because not only is it important to help guide your own decisions, but also important to help guide the change management process. You're not going to be able to please everyone. People have varying opinions on what they would like, which is really difficult, right? Especially if you're making a more of a homogenous decision for your people. But at least you can understand how different personas are feeling, why they're feeling the way that they are, and anticipate those challenges so that you can put in place some interventions or programs to help guide them back to whatever this new model is that you're putting in place. Even within Slalom, we've always been very remote. We're always on client sites, etc. So I thought that people would be very relaxed about whatever policy we put in place. And leadership has been very clear that it's a best for all and it's going to be very flexible, but we still have a lot of anxiety over the type of return to work that we're going to have, and a lot of anxiety about if they have the decision to stay home, what does that mean for them in their career? Will they have the same kind of equity and opportunity as those who are in the office full time? So that's also another thing that I'm sure will come up later in the conversation, to think through. If you are in more of a hybrid and you are allowing some people in the office and some from home, how do you make sure that leaders are staying connected to everyone in the same way? So it's very complex, but I think really understanding at the heart of it how your people are feeling and what those different persona groups are like, it just helps guide you in your journey of support for them as you transition.
Thanks, Katie. I know in my role, I have accountability for keeping track of vaccination status, health and safety status, and all of the changes that come with that around who's doing rapid testing, in what context. And that's a polarizing conversation. Depending on your perspective, and we won't get into the politics of vaccination status today, but there are a lot of different emotions around this. And as we start to think about the hybrid work environment and that polarized set of perspectives that our workforce has, with lots of different perspectives and emotions that come to the table, Heather, I wonder if you can share a little bit around how you manage that culture in a hybrid environment, and how do you bring those disparate perspectives together?
Yeah, I think it's really important, just building on what Katie said and what you were saying, everybody's had such a different experience throughout the pandemic, and they're coming back and with different perspectives. Some people are excited to be, part of an in-office workforce, other people less so. People are dealing with return to office anxiety. There's anxiety around, do I wear a mask? Do I not wear a mask? Is everybody actually vaccinated? There's all sorts of different anxieties as well. And so I think when we start thinking about One of the CEOs that I work with, a leader that I work with recently said to me, all I want to do is make sure that my team is happy. I thought, well, what if, such a simple sounding goal, but it's a very challenging goal to actually make everybody happy. So, one of the things that I talk a lot about is the role of communication, and not just communication, clear, intentional communication, as you're starting to navigate what this new world / continuation of the last 18, 20 months looks like. And that clarity is a real gift that you can give to employees as you're thinking about this. I talk about, a framework around the hybrid culture, that involves clarity, collaboration, connection, communication, and celebration. And all of those things play a really important role as you're being intentional about how you're shaping the work environment, whether it's online or whether it's in person. And, Brene Brown always says, clear is kind. And, this is whether it's in role clarity, responsibility clarity, but also as you're rolling this out, to Katie's point, you can do you can check the pulse of the organization. And, some are going to say, there's going to be a very broad spectrum of responses to it. But if the organization actually knows what kind of organization they want to build moving forward, in terms of if they feel like we're an in-person organization, they need to be clear about that. And there needs to be a really clear discussion with employees about what that means for people. And, if there is a real effort towards, working on this hybrid, being clear about this is a challenge for us. This is the first time we're doing this, and we're going to make some mistakes. And so we're going to be working on this together. So let's continue a dialogue that goes along about this. But I think it's really important to, be really open and honest and communicate often, and with the intention to listen to people and what their feedback is, but then also to try to integrate it. And don't ask a question, do you want to have a flexible work environment if you actually aren't going to actually have a flexible work environment. So I think, really be intentional with the questions you're asking, be intentional about how you're setting things up, and then listen as well to what you're hearing from the group, and incorporate as much as you can.
Thanks, Heather. I love that clarity is kind. It's a two-way street too. I mean, think about where we were in March of 2020. At that point in time, our workforce didn't have a choice. It sort of happened overnight. People went home instantaneously, and it was a condition in response to external factors that nobody could cope with. And so people just figured it out. And that's very different than what we're experiencing now, where there's a much more intentional, thoughtful, business-focused conversation around what does the organization need? How are we going to be successful as we move forward? How do we adapt? And that means the pace is quite different. It's not just figure it out and move on. But that clarity is something that cuts both ways. And Lauren, I wonder if you can comment on what you're hearing and how clear candidates are being in the marketplace about their expectations around the future of work.
It's such a great question. I think there are so many factors that are, in play at the moment with candidates. And I think it comes down to often, there's, I love this term, the great resignation. I think it's a fantastic marketing terminology. Whoever came up with that should be, applauded. But I think at least from where I'm sitting, it's more about the great realignment, right? I think that there is in play at the moment, employers' expectations and desires are not as aligned as they once were with what candidates' expectations and desires are. And so what a business feels is right for its future and its growth and its profitability and its workforce isn't always now what the people who are in that business feel is right for them as individuals. And so I think that we're seeing a lot more of candidates being more forward than they would have been in the past around saying, this is what I'm looking for. This is what I'm looking for in terms of, my where I work, how I work, when I work, what I get paid for what I work. We're hearing that a lot more. We're having candidates come to us and say, I'm making X, but unless it's Y, I am not interested, which we rarely have seen in the past. Part of that is this change in work as it relates to COVID. And part of it is that we're also in a very hot market. and candidates are aware that they have options and optionality, and they're being more forward in their asks because they know that they're empowered to do so. So it's kind of like this culmination of a number of factors that is creating this very interesting and unique situation around how employers are approaching the labor market and how employees are doing the same. And it would be so interesting to hear if other people are seeing that as well. But just from our perspective, it's very apparent.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's a particular challenge when people are thinking about the structure of work in their organizations, because employees are coming with expectations and employers are saying, well, hey, here's how we want to operate in the future. It brings into question all of these issues of when is a change of working conditions material? And Henrik, I'd love to have you sort of bring forward this question of what is a material change in working conditions? When does that border on constructive dismissal? What do employers need to do to navigate the way they rethink this cultural environment, but also the practicalities of the workplace?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it has a legal basis, which I'll address, and then the practical basis. So the legalities of constructive dismissal is if an employer unilaterally makes a fundamental change to the terms and conditions of someone's employment, you've effectively terminated them, and the employee can quit and then sue for wrongful dismissal. And the obvious question is, well, what's a fundamental change? And that really does depend on people's particular circumstances, but at high level, we tend to, this is not a rule of law, but a rule of practice. You make a change in compensation, a comp reduction of more than 10%, that's probably a constructive dismissal. That can be cash or equity based. You demote people, take away supervisory responsibilities. That's probably a constructive dismissal. And probably more relevant to our circumstances given the pandemic, place of work can be a fundamental component of people's employment. And so if you, I was always asked, we want to reopen, we want people back in the office. Now that people have worked for 18 months at home, is requiring them to come back a fundamental change that can amount to a constructive dismissal? The short answer to that, in my view, is no, it's not. The change that was made was the result of the pandemic and government-related orders that forced everyone to work remotely. That didn't change the terms of employment on a permanent basis. It was temporary. And now that we reopen, employers are within their rights to go back to what were the terms of employment, namely, you're expected to be in the office, so long as it can be done safely, right? That's always the operating presumption. So asking people to come back to work now that we can open up is perfectly legitimate, and people who say no aren't being constructively dismissed. Now, that's the legalities. And I go back to Lauren's point. Well, we don't have a whole lot of power sometimes to take such a hard stance, because you're going to have people walking out the door going across the street to your competitors. So what do you do practically? I mean, practically speaking, I mean, employers just have to be responsive. I mean, I think there's a question about, I saw a question pop up in the chat. I saw a reference to generations, and then that's, I'm not sure this is what the question was, but this certainly is a generational issue. There are certain generations who like working from home and who expect to work from home, at least partially, and employers need to be responsive to that or risk losing their top talent. And similarly, there are, and I've heard stories of this, there are some young people who can't wait to get back to the office because they're stuck in their small condo or apartment, and they don't want to be there anymore, and they want to see their friends and colleagues again. And so employers have to be responsive there too. Or you run the risks that Lauren has very clearly identified, and both Heather and Katie have addressed.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge, and I'll happily share. RBC did a study recently and asked our employees, how are they feeling, and how much is what they are feeling about their preferences around return to work, how much is it aligned to what they think RBC is asking for in terms of return to work? And this is the dichotomy. I guess the question is, what recommendations do we have to foster influencers, to help people bring forward that culture? And Heather, I'll come back to you and ask the question, are there specific tactics that you think we can use that drive cultural alignment and help bring the organization's expectations and the employees' expectations into that alignment and get through that great misalignment that we're all struggling to get to come together?
I think I'll go back to, it's very important to have an understanding as an organization, how you want to move forward and, be really intentional about that. And so it's not easy to we can't just haphazardly move forward and expect everything to fall into line the way we want it to fall into. There's going to be some people that are, in terms of creating the culture you want, there's going to be some people bumping into each other, still in the office, and others that won't have that opportunity. So there needs to be a lot of intention around several things. So, when we look at collaboration, that is a great way to drive connection within an organization. So really putting together opportunities for different people in the organization to collaborate together, whether, like even the collaboration around us all leaving the office at once. That was a shared activity that really actually bonded people and got people galvanized towards doing something. It wasn't, the thing we would have liked to have done, but that was something that actually allowed everybody to kind of act quickly and collaborate. Now we need to think about consistent things that allow for consistent collaboration, that allow for ways to people to connect with each other. People that are connected to the organization are less likely to leave the organization and more likely to stay within the organization. So finding those opportunities for people to connect and feel connected to the organization and feel that the organization believes in them. So whether it's through, committees that you find and you put people, you have different, whether you're doing it through committee or whether you're doing it through other means, making sure that teams find a purpose and a reason to collaborate together to build that connection. I think the other piece too is something that's been very, very effective in organizations I've worked with this hybrid model in particular, is developing norms for how you communicate together, norms for how you act in a meeting together, norms for when a camera is on or when a camera isn't on, and a shared understanding of how you're going to act together. So, I do a communication playbook often with organizations to help them think through the different challenges that they're going to face in terms of all the different medium of communication, how there's access to the senior people in the organization, managers, peers, how you can connect in ways. And it's like any kind of relationship, you have relationships take work. And, the relationship that an employee has with their employer, that the leaders have with their teams, these are relationships. And so thinking about them as things where you need to be intentional with the way you're interacting with each other. And in this case, you need to put even more effort towards making sure that there are the opportunities for people to connect with each other, that there are the opportunities to celebrate. Some have like a social, so back to the days of a social committee in an office. How do you have shared opportunities to celebrate things? So when you're thinking about it, it's that active intention to make sure that you're actually thinking through not just that, we might have the opportunity to interact, that we might have the opportunity to connect and build that strongly. It's that you plan it forward. And then that creates the environment where, oh, you know what? There's emails going around for birthdays. Okay, that's great. Like I can send that out, to somebody, or there's a thank you that goes out whenever we do this. Well, that's a celebration. So you're creating that kind of culture where it's okay to be grateful, where that's integrated into it. So whatever it is that you want to do, you model it and you set some intention around it and set up the ability and the purpose around how you're going to connect with each other.
That's great. Thanks, Heather. Katie, I'm thinking about this question that we had Matt Pavlich raised, and Matt, great to see you. Matt asked, is Gen X experiencing this differently than a millennial? And I think there's perhaps some misconceptions there, right? There's this belief that all millennials are super happy about not being in the workplace and having freedom to move wherever they want. But as Henrik said, there's also millennials who just want to get back to the office. Gen X maybe is having a different experience. the aging workforce is also the workforce that's least comfortable with technology and doesn't want to be looking at a screen all day. And so we see the impact of that. How do you respond to that generational divide that's sort of an overlay?
Yeah, I think it's a tough one. And I think you're right. I think we have to understand that our own unconscious or conscious bias around generation is probably wrong. And we need to question it, right? So we might have a certain assumptions about how certain generations feel, but we don't know for sure. And just like you said, I think there was a big assumption that millennials or even Gen Zers, are really happy working remote because they want flexibility. But we are seeing that some youngins, like Henrik said, and how you just mentioned, Danielle, they want to get out of their tiny apartments and want to be around people. So I think, again, listening to your employee base, and if you're comfortable with setting some demographics around that, it can be very helpful to try to see if there are similarities in age groups, but you might find that there isn't. There might be that divide among generations as well. I think that actually might be more common than we think. Unfortunately, I haven't seen specific stats myself. I'm sure maybe some of the others on the panel might have a bit more insight. So I can't attest to any trend that I'm particularly seeing. But again, I think seeking to understand your employees and where they're at, and if you are able to divide by some demographic, it could be helpful. I do like what you said about the technology thing, right? And I think Heather was kind of alluding to this too, is it's great if you have some of these, communication technologies and things like this. And we see, especially through the pandemic, it's like, oh, we started to use Teams. But when you ask, like, how's that working for you? Well, we don't really know how to use it and we don't have norms and it's very frustrating. So it's all about that adoption, right? And really seeking to understand intentionally how you want to use it and how you help people adopt it. Even for those who might find it a bit more challenging, you might have to, spend a bit more time on those programs to really help them understand how it can actually help them in the long run and save them some time and frustration. So not an easy challenge. I think it's a great question, but I think something that we should be questioning as well to say, are we right in our assumptions? And is there a way that we can find that truth?
I think that's spot on. And, there's this idea of there's this misalignment that we're struggling with today. And there's cultural overtones, there's hybrid work components, there's generational components. And I've lost who made the comment, but somebody a few minutes ago, Brenda, said that there was misalignment around expectations between employees and employers, even before the pandemic, that this has put a spotlight on it. I think about the specifics of that misalignment. There's a fantastic ad on TV with a Caribbean country that's saying, hey, come work here. You can work anywhere. And I think that's a myth that, you can work anywhere. And so Henrik, we've got this employee expectation that the flexibility is infinite. What are the employer's obligations around supporting or accommodating those kinds of requests? Like, I want to work from the Croatian Riviera or from the mountains in BC, and your office is in downtown Toronto. What does the employer need to think about?
The short answer is that employers have no legal obligation to allow these things. I mean, there is no positive obligation to accommodate such requests. Leaving aside the practical realities as we know them and trying to keep your talent, because you may have to bend there in order to keep your top talent. But one thing I will flag for employers here, because I was asked this question when the pandemic began, and because a bunch of employees just left. They just went overseas. And the one that stuck in my mind is an employer on the West Coast had an employee who had family in India and just up and left and went to India and said, by the way, I'm working from here now. And the employer comes to me and says, what do we do about this? And the short answer there was, you don't allow that. I mean, there are laws in India, none of which I know, none of which they know. And you can't just have your workforce work in other territories and be ignorant of their local laws. There may be local employment standards laws that would apply to you. There may be tax issues that do they have the requisite papers to work in that jurisdiction? I mean, all of which are important questions, none of which were answered in that scenario. And so what I told the employers, I said, give them a bit of time to come back. And if they don't come back, employment relationship's over. Guess what happened? Employment relationship's over, because the employee had no intention of ever coming back again. And fortunately, we haven't heard from said employee since. So if I'm an employer in this circumstance, I would, before I agree to anything like that, look into those questions about what legal obligations you may be exposing yourself to in these other jurisdictions before entertaining these types of requests.
I would also just add there, there's hidden costs as well. As an employer, you may be willing to support someone working from an alternate location, but if that's not an operating jurisdiction from you, how are you going to handle payroll? How are you going to handle the tax implications? There's a number of considerations there. Are there going to be liability issues? Will your healthcare programs cover people when they're working in a jurisdiction that you don't operate in? There's quite a few things to consider there around just the cost of employment in those situations where you may actually want to accommodate key talent in some unique ways that you hadn't thought about before. But do be sure to think through the unintended consequences. Jean-Francois raised a question about how important is the role of technology in supporting the hybrid workplace. I will be the first to say I'm fine with remote work, comfortable in this setting. I hate not having a whiteboard. And I have tried every piece of whiteboard technology on the planet. Mural seems to be the one that works the best for me, but I have whiteboard envy. I miss my giant whiteboards and the ability to put a bunch of stickers on the wall and bring people together around that conversation. And it's just not the same virtually. That type of collaboration, I personally find really hard to manage in a virtual space. So I'll throw the question out there. How important is technology to supporting the hybrid work environment? And are there key technology challenges other than my whiteboard problem that people have?
Can I just throw
Yeah.
Can I just throw one thing out there? Because I'm totally with you on that whiteboard. And I've recently gone back to doing strategic planning in person. And even though I haven't been able to be the person writing on the board, just that act of seeing words go up on a board is just so fun. And it changes the dynamic because it is different. So there are certain times you can collaborate online. Definitely, there's some great tools, but there is something to that in-person connection around, seeing things go up on that whiteboard. But the other thing I just wanted to sort of add in around that is the technology piece around how you can kind of hide a little bit as well and kind of fly under the radar. And so there's different ways, and this is where this communication playbook and how you're going to use the technology, I think, becomes a really important piece for organizations, because some people are using Slack to have an argument or to post something really important, and kind of defining where you're going to have certain types of conversations, especially when they're a typed in conversation as opposed to an in-person or telephone conversation. And so really getting clear about how you use those pieces of technology, because when technology works, it's fantastic. We all have the Zoom glitches that we've had during meetings, but when it works, it can be really a great tool, but it can also be a very dangerous tool. Things can escalate really quickly when you can't see the face of a person and you've just typed something in all caps, or you've put an exclamation mark at a certain point, and it's kind of impacted people in a different way than if you had tapped somebody on the shoulder and had that same conversation. So just the framing of technology, I think, is an important piece as we're thinking about this.
I love this point about people tend to hide. You can send what should be a live conversation in a big long email and then just gone. Okay, what just happened? How do you respond to that? Katie, are you seeing those kinds of issues in your work as well?
Yeah, it's kind of, for us, it's multifaceted, because we have, and I'm sure Heather probably feels this as well, but like we have our internal communications with, our teams, our project teams, but then we also have the communications with clients, right? So there's a bit of both. I've used whiteboarding intentionally with my internal teams. Like we go into the office once in a while and we'll have our time together. I think that, like Heather mentioned, technology can either help or hinder the ways that we work. So I think, you know, one of the things we've done is kind of seek to understand where the pain points are in people's working lives now that we're working in a new way. And do those pain points directly correlate to the use of technology? So for example, people were finding, you know, within our own Slalom team, that they felt like their workload had increased significantly, almost doubled. And the reason for that was actually we were finding they felt like they had more meetings. So when we really look at how you start to book meetings, a 5-minute conversation passed by in the office now defaults to a 30-minute conversation because you just put it in your calendar for 30 minutes and didn't think about the fact that you only needed 10. So you start seeing different trends in the way that technology kind of shapes our day. So I think being intentional about seeking to understand those hindrances, and then like Heather said, creating a bit of a playbook to say, hey, how do we do meeting audits? How do we figure out, are these the right meetings? Do we have an actual agenda? And I've loved the phrase, no agenda, no attenda, right? Like if you don't have an agenda on it, I'm not coming, I don't need to come. You need to tell me what this is about. So kind of, yeah, intervening in some ways. I think also seeking to help people understand some of the benefits that certain technologies come with. And helping people understand what those can be. So a great example for me that was really eye-opening was close to the beginning of the pandemic. We had a particular client that we were going to do a whiteboarding session with that would have been in person normally, but we were going to do it remotely. This was for a cultural transformation for a police organization, okay? And we were talking to people at the front line about their culture and about the negativities that was coming in from their culture. We ended up using Mural and people were able to log in anonymously. So even though we could talk to them and we could say things, when they were adding to the whiteboard, we had no idea who was adding what. We got some insights from that we know for a fact we would not have gotten if we were in person. So I think understanding some of the benefits that certain technologies can come with can help sort of enlighten people and encourage them to use them in new ways. But it can be hard when you're just like, I just want to be in person. I just want to have a whiteboard and thinking about what used to be rather than trying to think about the opportunities that come with some of these new technologies.
It's so funny that you comment on that. We actually have been using Mural anonymously for engagement feedback.
Yeah.
And exactly the same thing. We got feedback on topics that no one would ever have given us live.
Exactly.
So it's this trade-off. We have an array of tools at our disposal in a hybrid model that is really quite powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Jean-Francois raises the question here about what happens when you've got half of the team online and half of the team remote. So you're in that situation where you've got the boardroom, there's a camera up on the wall, a bunch of people are in windows, but there's also a bunch of people just talking to each other. And those two conversations don't meld naturally. That's one example of the challenge of the hybrid workspace. Matt says people have got to be in theater seating. Can't be around a boardroom table so that you're still part of the same interaction. Other suggestions, things we need to be doing to really anticipate that blend of FaceTime, real conversation, those ad hoc sidebars, and the virtual setting at the same time.
So it's interesting that comment about the theater seating, because I do have a client that when they have this kind of scenario, they have people sit in like the phone booth, their office, and so that everybody in the meeting, there aren't people sitting in a meeting room and pictures on the screen. Everybody has a picture on the screen. And it's like a joke at this one organization that I work with, like even I'm in the office and I'm still virtual, but sometimes to have the shared experience, that's one way to actually navigate it so you continue to have the shared experience, or to have a norm around no side conversations in the room. You have to share with the rest of the team because you're in a meeting together, even though you're not in shared physical spaces.
But I think just being intentional and mindful about those realities. And if you think about sort of the early days of conference calls, you'd have all these people shuffling their paper at the boardroom table, and then somebody in the conference call who you can hear from the ceiling, and it's such a frustrating experience. This is the next iteration of that in so many ways. I do want to thank everybody who's been dropping questions into the chat room as we've been going along. Please keep it up. I'm a little conscious of time as well. I want to get to the topic of health and safety. We have an environment right now where there is certainly a lot of disparate opinion on what is safe, what is healthy. We talked about our masks required and some of these sorts of things. Are there some critical considerations around health and safety, Henrik, that particularly around the issues of personal privacy, and obligations around testing programs or mandatory vaccination. What's on the horizon? What do people need to be anticipating today?
That easy question, right, Danielle?
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. Softball for you.
Yeah, that's right. Well, look, the good news is that at least in Ontario, we've got some recent decisions from labor arbitrators in the unionized context that give us some guidance on where we think the lines will be drawn. It's not crystal clear, and I'll tell you about, there's 3 cases that have been released within the last couple of weeks, and I'll tell you about them in a second. But just as background, outside of long-term care and outside of federally regulated transportation, generally speaking, unlike in the United States, there is not a mandate, there's no mandate to vaccinate or test from the governments. Governments have generally taken a hands-off approach to the private sector and said, you figure it out. And that's resulted in a whole disparate array of policies and has led to these cases that we've recently seen. So the first is a case called Paragon Supply Security. And Paragon had a mandatory vaccination policy. So all of their employees had to be vaccinated. And the union challenged that requirement, and they were unsuccessful. The arbitrator said that because Paragon's clients insisted that their security staff whom they supply be vaccinated, that was an important factor to justify the vaccination requirement, plus their collective agreement contemplated vaccination. So that's the Paragon case, very context specific. Then we've got the ESA case, the Electrical Safety Authority case, which had a mandatory vaccination policy as well. And if you didn't comply by certain deadlines, then you would be terminated. Hold on, I gotta tell someone in the background to turn off a vacuum cleaner because it's really distracting. I hope it's not distracting you.
We can't hear it.
Sorry about that. So I'm not in the office, as you've now learned. So the ESA case was decided that a mandatory vaccination policy that resulted in discipline and ultimately termination was not reasonable. And that was specific to the circumstances of the Electrical Safety Authority. Principally, the arbitrator said, look, I'm not saying that this should be a vindication for people who are against vaccines. This turns on the facts of that particular employer who has had a large portion of their workforce work remotely, who has not had a history of outbreaks within those who aren't working remotely. And so having a policy that says everybody's got to be vaccinated is not reasonable in that context. That decision has been strongly criticized by those who are in favor of mandates, and likewise has been lauded by those who are skeptical of mandates. And then we move to what appears to be the quintessential middle ground, which is the vaccinate or test policies. So that's the Ontario Power Generation case. And in OPG said, look, we're not gonna, you don't want to be vaccinated, fine, no problem. But you will have to be subjected to once weekly rapid antigen testing on your own time, and you have to pay for it. That's what the policy was. You got to pay for the test, you got to do it on your own time, and you got to submit it to us in order to come in to work. And if you don't comply, you'll be placed on an unpaid leave. That was the policy. The arbitrator found that the vaccinate or test policy is presumptively reasonable, that employers need to pay for the test. He thought that was fair, but employees need to take the test on their own time. So it's not paid time. You have to do it before you come into work. And the protocol by which they submitted that information, namely they uploaded the information to an app that was centralized, that had security protocols around it, that was reviewed by a very limited number of individuals, and other precautions to protect confidential information, which this is confidential medical information being uploaded. All of that was found to be reasonable. So for the most part, that policy was upheld. except for employers need to pay. And they pointed to the history of litigation with respect to mandatory drug testing, that as a justification. Mandatory drug testing is paid for by an employer. So they say, de facto, employers should pay for it. Now, does this mean what I've just told you, that these are the hard and fast rules going forward? No, I mean, they give us some guideposts, namely, there is some skepticism towards mandates, particularly if your workplace is remote or has no history of outbreaks. And there is an endorsement of a vaccinate or test model, which, given the history leading up into the pandemic, wasn't presumptively deemed to be reasonable. I mean, prior to this pandemic, there was a bunch of litigation in the healthcare context about vaccinate or mask policies with respect to flu season. And so a bunch of hospitals introduced a policy that said, if you're not going to vaccinate against the flu, you need to wear a mask for the entirety of the flu season, which was 6 months out of the year. And those policies were struck down as being unreasonable. So there was a lot of skepticism about vaccinate or test in this pandemic. So that skepticism appears to be unwarranted. So, all of this gives you some idea of where arbitrators are landing. We have no idea what the courts will do because the courts haven't adjudicated this issue yet outside of the union context. There have been a couple injunction cases, but they haven't decided the merits of the policies. So that's a big question mark. You tend to have a bit more latitude, let's say, as an employer outside of a unionized workforce. I've certainly seen that with my non-union employers. They're a little bit more bullish on having vaccine mandates, but I mean, time will tell.
Certainly changes from week to week. I personally sort of wake up and look at the news in the morning and wonder, okay, what new issue is coming up today? And it's all about the pivot right now. I do want to open the floor to questions. If I think we've covered most of what was picked up in the chat, but if people have specific topics or issues they'd like to raise, we'd love to hear from all of you.
As we're getting to that, would you mind if I jumped in around technology and culture? I thought Brenda's question was really on point.
Absolutely, go for it.
Oh, fantastic. So that is such an interesting question, and it kind of aligns with my philosophy in life, which is be as actively grateful as you can and complain as much as possible. And I find that technology fulfills that right now during the pandemic. My father often likes to tell me when I start to complain, would you have rather this happened in 1982? Which of course the answer is no. But I find that just from a cultural perspective, technology has become this great crutch, positively and negatively. And I actually had a candidate who we were working with on a search mandate, who said to me, I have worked at this company for 2 years and I have never met anyone that I work with in person. And it makes me feel like I'm a pen pal. Oh. And I thought that was a really interesting topic. He says, I've met everyone, I see them virtually, but I don't have a connection with them beyond the screen. Okay. And I think that as we talk about this, obviously I have a very specific perspective on recruitment and retention, but I feel that it is somewhat easier for individuals to think about leaving the family they're with if they only feel like they're pen pals to that family. And I think it is an obligation for an organization. If culture is an important factor for you in retention, some organizations, culture is at the bottom of their list, but for some, culture is at the core of what they are. And I think that thinking about people that have joined during this pandemic who are in the family, but not as someone who has been there for years and has made those bonds internally through social interaction, there is an obligation of the organization to start thinking about how do those people create those long-term bonds, or either A, will lose them or they won't be as fulfilled in the jobs they're doing. And I have just found that to be a very interesting flip side of technology.
So true. I have two thoughts in my mind and they're not lining up well in terms of flow. So I'll respond to what Lauren just said around understanding and listening and watching and monitoring for departure. We are starting into a phase of work where people may not have met each other before. And if you hired people during the pandemic and they've never had that attachment, we hear a lot in the news about the Great Resignation. I think the Great Resignation is more prominent as a theme in the US than it is in Canada. That's not to say that it's not a hot market. People are leaving at a rapid pace compared to what they were doing in the midst of the uncertainty of the pandemic itself. And so I would encourage everybody to be monitoring attrition through that lens of tenure. People who have joined more recently have less affinity to that culture, to that organization, to that mission and vision because of the conditions in which they joined. I also want to bring it back to a thread that's playing through in the chat, which is Mike Stone asks, can we ask an employee if they've been vaccinated? And is that a privacy challenge? And Henrik just picked up on it. Shorter answer is yes, you can ask. But the employee has no obligation to answer. Would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, so the employee's vaccination status is a privacy right. It is not unlawful for an employer to ask, particularly in this context. But an employee has no obligation to answer. And then the question becomes, well, what are the consequences of that? So if an employee refuses to answer, what can you do? And the short answer is you treat them as if they were unvaccinated. So most policies that I've been involved in creating are hybrid policies. I've done some mandatory policies for certain employers. I've got lots of employers who have tried to do the vaccinator test. And we say, you have a deadline to disclose whether you are vaccinated or not. And you can tell us if you're vaccinated or not by that deadline. If you don't, we just put you into the group of people who are deemed to be unvaccinated. And that means you're subject to additional requirements, one being testing. Often another one is a requirement to wear PPE in the workplace, even if local health authorities don't mandate it. And that's essentially in perpetuity, subject to things changing. So and that's perfectly legitimate. It respects people's privacy rights to refuse to disclose, and it respects the employer's obligation to take all reasonable measures to protect the health and safety of their workers in the workplace. And I think that's a fair balance.
It is a bit of a tight balancing act, though, because on the one hand, we have this duty of care to protect people's privacy in terms of their vaccination status. But the minute you, for whatever reason, have deemed them unvaccinated and impose additional health and safety precautions as a result, you must wear a mask, you can't eat lunch in the general lunchroom, you need to remove yourself when you're not wearing your mask. This puts a spotlight on that person as somehow being different. And so while you haven't disclosed personal privacy in terms of the vaccine decision, maybe they're unvaccinated, maybe they don't want to tell you, maybe they have a health exclusion, maybe they have a religious exclusion, although we haven't seen any evidence of those as yet. Those are all reasons that people may not be vaccinated. They're all different from each other. And so you haven't actually disclosed their personal decision in that context, but you have isolated them. And so now we have something that's actually working at odds with all of the other conversation we just had around building an inclusive culture, working across the hybrid space. We're actually imposing something that creates separation at the same time. And so that's a pretty difficult challenge culturally. Heather, I know we haven't talked about this one. I can see the wheels turning for you as you think through this one. Anything you want to add to that conversation?
I think that's a visible difference, for these people. And it is something that needs to be managed very carefully. And this gets back to, I think, that important role of communication, because, how this is being communicated, not just to the individual it's happening to, but to others around, because this is going to cause a bit of a segregation. I think it's probably difficult not to when somebody is visibly different than other people. But, this is also a place where empathy comes into play, and modeling that as a leader, and also, trying to have your employees have some empathy for others in the organization as well. That's an important piece through this that we don't often talk about, but, people, came into this with a different experience, are now still experiencing this reintegration or this mixture of this hybrid, work environment. And so everybody's experiencing it differently. People are fatigued. People are fatigued from being on camera. People are fatigued from being in person, even if they're excited to be in person. So there's a lot of different emotional factors that need to come into play. And this is where tapping into a bit of empathy, and also as a leader, giving yourself, what I call the energy sandwich, to kind of help you through these days where it takes a lot of extra time and energy and intention to make these kind of changes and to build this environment. And leaders have a great opportunity right now to really shape the environment. And that takes a lot of energy. So they've got to be kind to themselves as well as they're thinking through how they're going to, navigate really challenging situations like this with empathy, but also, with clarity as they're moving forward to try to keep these people connected. Some are hanging on by a thread, but to try to keep that connection as much as possible, because to Lauren's point, those people are more likely to stay then. The more connected they are, the more likely they are to stay within the organization.
So thank you, Heather. We are almost at the top of the hour here. I'm going to give the last word to Katie. Can you comment on diversity and inclusion as part of this full view?
Yeah.
30 seconds or less, big topic. What's the headline?
I was trying to type to Brenda. The headline is, it's significant. I would encourage those who have any influence over these types of programs of support to seek some understanding on how intersectionality of race, gender, age, and any sort of sexual orientation or gender orientation is being affected. There are articles out on that. So seek to understand some of that, and seek to understand the types of people and personas that you have within your organization. So like, as an example, right, we're a little bit concerned about new parents and wanting to work from home more. And if they're given that flexibility, fantastic. But what does that mean for them and their career development versus a perhaps young individual who's in the office all the time and has that face time with leadership? So something to be very aware of, start to anticipate where those intersectionalities might cause some disproportionate effects to individuals, and seek some interventions to help and to help leadership understand where those biases or where those intersections can hinder individuals within the workplace. But nothing we can solve in 30 seconds.
No, it's so true, but great points.
Yeah.
Listen, I would like to thank everyone who was able to join us today for this conversation, and for all of the great questions and prompts that you gave us throughout the session. One special thanks to our speakers, Katie, Hendrik, Lauren, Heather, but especially to Threx Scott, who sponsors our activities with the Harvard Business School Club of Toronto, and to Boris, who is bringing us all together. I hope you found the conversation engaging and exciting, and we look forward to having you at future events.
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks, Boris.
Fantastic. Thanks for including us.
Thanks for
Thanks,
having
everybody.
me. It was
Goodbye.
great.
Have a good one.